Welcome everyone. We are going to take a look, kind of a quick introduction to some of the standard lights inside of Maya 2019, and then we're going to look at a couple of the Arnold lights as well. So we're going to look at in the standard lights, we're going to look at spots, points, area, and directional lights. And then under Arnold lights, we're going to look at the Skydome, we're going to look at mesh lights and area lights, and maybe just talk a little bit about photometrics, but we're not going to get into those because those take a little bit more work. So I just made a quick little weird alien horned creature thing here, and I brought in a little ground plane. I basically just went to my poly modeling and grabbed one of these polygon planes and put it underneath it. And the reason I did that is with lights, sometimes it's kind of nice to see how it's creating different types of shadows for your object in the world. So if I wanted to, I could just scale up this polygon plane a little bit bigger and just give myself some room to work with, so I can kind of see how the lights affect this unique shape that I've created. So right off the bat, I'm going to go ahead over, instead of the poly modeling tab, I'm going to move over to the rendering tab. And under rendering, these are the standard lights. These work with like the software and the hardware render in Maya. And so right off the bat, you have an ambient light that you can bring in. And if we look, we've got this ambient light. We can move it around. It actually looks like a little tiny sun. You can scale it, but that doesn't really do anything. Really, all you can do is move this around, and it doesn't have a whole lot of options to it. But over here, under the attributes for it, you can see it definitely has an intensity. It has shadows, built-in shadows. You can do more advanced ray trace shadows that are going to bounce kind of light around a little bit more and do some more calculations to enhance those. But for the most part, ambient lights are pretty simple. They kind of mimic the sun. So how do I know what this looks like though? Because right now I'm not really seeing any representation of that. If I go to shading, there isn't like a shading with light. So we really do have to be able to render things. And to make sure this looks right, we want to make sure the right render's turned on. So up here at the top, they look like the little kind of director cut, the little guys when you're starting a movie, like, and shoot and cut. So if I go to the one with the little blue gear icon and I click on it, these are my render settings. And when I'm working with standard lights, for the most part, you would use these with like the software or hardware render. You can totally use them with Arnold Render, although their intensities have to be turned way up to make them visible. So right now, I'm going to just, to see them a little easier, I'm going to turn on the Maya software renderer. And that's it for right now, and then I'm going to close that window. We'll get into render settings later for more advanced rendering. But you can see I've pulled that light up above it. And now if I hit this little button here, which is the open render view, this will actually open up a little window here. And I got some error. I'm not sure what's going on, but hopefully it doesn't affect my software render. And if I hit this little guy here, render current frame, there we go. You can kind of see what happens. And it's definitely lit up my scene. I can bring this a little bit closer and see how it changes things. A little bit of the shadows on the front. I'm looking at this object right now in preview mode. It's actually pretty polygonal in nature. So I'm gonna go ahead and just smooth it real quick. Let me go to my modeling toolkit and smooth this. Let's give it like a subdivision of 3. Okay, cool. Now it'll actually be smooth in my renders. So I'm going to zoom in on this guy a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. Alright, let's do the same thing again. Let's render. There we go. So it's a very kind of just like, standard light. It lights up the whole area. It's an ambient light, like I said. It really just kind of gives you sort of a fill across the whole environment. If I play around with anything, let me go back to the light and its attributes. I could bring up or down the intensity of it. I could really dim out the light, and you'll see the difference here as I render again. Let me render that. It's way more gray now. Or I can bring up the intensity. And, I could play around, maybe let's see what it does with the ray trace shadows. So let's bring that up real quick. I clicked on that toggle. So it's pretty bright right now. I want to bring that intensity back down a bit. Yeah, it's a pretty washed out light. Again, I just use it to kind of light up big outdoor scenes, ambient light, kind of mimic the sun. So pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Now if I render this right now, I still have like a default light set. So if I render this, you can see how much more shadow there is. The ambient light really washes out a lot of that shadow detail, kind of flattens things out. So even just with the default light set, I have more shadow and definition around the object, right? All right, let's try another light. Let me close the render view real quick. We have a directional light, and I'm going to go ahead and move this up. It's actually inside my object right now. And you see this guy has some arrows on it. I'm going to go to four-way view just so we can look at which way the arrows. Let me zoom out a little bit on a couple of these. Let's do view, frame all, view, frame all. Just so we can kind of see the whole scene here. So I want to make sure that my directional light is pointed in the right direction or it's not going to light up my object correctly, right? So I want to point those arrows at my object. So I'm going to go ahead and point them downward at least. And then in this view, in my front view, I'm going to, oh, nope, let's go ahead and rotate it a little bit. Just give it sort of a slightly off center view. And let's move these over and let's move them upward a little bit. I can scale these up too just to make them a little bit larger and hit a larger area. I want it to just not just hit part of my object. I want it to kind of light up the whole object. I can move it free form as well. Let's see how that does. So I'm going to go to my perspective view here. I'm going to click on my open render view and there we go. Nice directional. I mean, obviously a lot of shadow down below because it's kind of coming from above. You know, I could keep moving this a little bit differently. I can bring it so it's like really intersecting with it. Let's see what that does to the light. Not too much, but I'll tell you if I change it over here and hit it. Whoa. Close that. Rotate this guy around just a little bit. Hit it from the other side. There we go. There we go. Now you can see it's kind of lit up the right side of it and cast shadow. So again, nice light. I can play around with all sorts of things. I can bring up the intensity if I don't think it's bright enough. There we go. I've got a brighter light now. I can change the color on it by clicking on that little white box. I can make this a red light instead of a white light. You can actually change these lights anytime you want from this type drop down as well. I don't have to go up there and like delete it every time and make a new one. So there are some fun different lights in here. Shadows again that I can play around with. Use depth. These ones have a bit more control to them. There's actually some fog elements and resolution. So more than the ambient light, this guy does have a lot more that it can do. Let me change that from a red back to a white light. And let's see what happens when I turned on those. So there we go. Now I have it casting shadows. It's a little rough and funky right now. I could bring up the resolution on that. There we go. Now I'm getting a cleaner shadow off of that. If I, sorry, keep that shadow color the same way. Let me bring the resolution up to like 5,000. Even cleaner yet. So, you know, lots of possibilities for what we can do here. Try to render that out a little bit more. There we go. And it really casts a nice shadow across it, not just on the object, but then onto the object underneath it. You know, you can play around with all of this stuff and filter sizes and bias and fog, shadow intensity. Now, the more you up these settings, the longer it takes for render, especially when we get into Arnold, which does a lot more calculations. So please do keep that in mind. Let's see though, I could probably, like right now, the inside of my object's really dark. So what if I brought this out and also kind of tilted it that way a little bit? So it's kind of coming in from the front. There you go. Now I'm filling in more on the front of it and kind of sending that shadow behind it. So always, you know, good to kind of really like play around with the position of your light. One thing you can do with a light like this is you can actually say in your perspective view here, you can do it in any perspective view. I can go to panels and I can say look through selected. I have to select my light, so I have to select the directional light, and then like I said, panels, look through selected. Now I'm actually looking through the light, so I can exactly like almost target what part of the object, and I can use my just regular navigation, which is great, navigation tools to kind of like rotate around and kind of decide where I'm going. Oh, I kind of clicked on the plane down below. But and I can kind of come out here and zoom around and say, oh yeah, actually I wanted to light up the front of this nicely, right? And then I go back to my panels and go to perspective view, and then go ahead and render that. And now I've got it lit up from the front very nicely, the shadows behind it, right? So that's kind of a cool trick. You can use that with any light. You can do, like I said, panels, look through selected, but I have to select the light first, so a lot of fun. All right, so those are directional lights, standard directional lights. We also have just like a point light. I use these a lot as fill lights to kind of fill in certain areas when there's a part that's maybe too shadowy. So these are little tiny guys, but again, you can scale them up, which is great. You don't actually see much of a representation there in the screen. It's really about like the intensity that you do. But say I put this underneath here, it's really just going to kind of light up underneath that one arm. And let's see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead, click in this view, bring up a render. You can see my light is just underneath there right now, right? If I click on that guy and move it over to the right, then I render again, and now it's lighting up the right side of it. Now I could increase the intensity on that quite a bit, and you can see it's lighting up the whole floor and up above. If I move this up above my object and maybe out towards the front a little bit and render again, now I'm getting this whole side of it. So I use these all the time. Like I said, they're great little lights to just kind of like fill in other areas. I might use it with a directional or with a spotlight just to kind of highlight little areas. Could bring its intensity down quite a bit there. There we go, soften it up a little bit. And again, it has all these shadow controls. I can turn on my use depth map shadows. I could play around with some of these settings here, but if I just do that, now you'll see it's casting shadows onto the rest of the environment, not just onto that one, not just lighting scenes up. It's actually casting shadows all over the place, right? And again, I could play with the resolution of those shadows, boost that quite a bit, and get a higher quality, but it does take a bit more render time to do that. So, lots of possibilities depending on what you're wanting to do. But these little point lights get used all the time. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Now, one of the really fun ones is Spotlight. Oh, I realized I didn't delete my point light. Let's get rid of that guy. Let's go to the Spotlight. It actually looks like a little flashlight icon up here. I'm going to click on that. Now, a spotlight actually is going to give you a shape. It actually looks like a little cone spotlight would be. So this would just be just like a theater spotlight. And it's really about aiming these in the direction that you want them to go, right? So spotlight is very directional, but it actually gives you a shape to that direction as well. So I use these all the time as well when I have like a dramatic light, maybe like a street light coming down on a subject, or like kind of a theatrical lighting scenario. And these definitely can be scaled. They have a lot of interaction to them. Oh, just saving real quick. I can kind of change the length of the light there. All of this can be done in the attributes as well, though. So I can change the cone angle here in the attributes. I can make it wider or more narrow. So maybe I want to hit the whole thing there. The penumbra we'll talk about a little bit, and then the drop off is sort of like, is it like a solid shape of light that it creates, or does it kind of fall off around the edges? So I'm going to go ahead and just show you what this looks like. Let's bring up the render window again. See how this one gives you that perfect kind of like spotlight view. So it's lighting up the top there, but obviously the arms are not. Let's play with the penumbra a little bit here. Let's increase that, and let's increase the drop off, and you'll see what happens there. Now I have sort of that shape in the center. It's lighting up the center, and then it's slowly, the drop off is that fade off from the bright area to the dark. So you get like a nice gradient of light there that's happening, right? Maybe I want to increase my intensity on that and try again. There we go. Now I've got a really nice kind of lit up top, and then it fades off around the arms. If I bring that penumbra back in, oh, let's just go to 0 instead of -10. See the difference on that. See how that just softened the edge of it? Like it still has the fade from the drop off, but when I increase the penumbra angle, then that edge of the spotlight fades off as well. And that penumbra is really that kind of like edge of the light, that filtering of the edge. So that's really nice. If I bring that inward, I haven't done that on a negative. Okay, so that brings it inward on a negative from the edge instead to the outward, which is really cool. All right. Beyond that, there's some light effects in here. It has fog, shadows again. I could use depth shadows. And so if I bring that in, now I get more shadow from the shadow of the object casting down in there, which is really nice. You can kind of play around and get the resolutions of all of that. A little harder to see in this particular scenario, but if I maybe boost out the cone angle a little bit and maybe make it just a little bit longer, let's see how that looks. There we go. I'm getting at least more of the profile around it, which is cool. So really useful lights, use them all the time. There's a lot more to them than this. Like I said, this is just kind of a brief introduction. A lot of possibilities of what you can do with these. You can put on barn doors, which is sort of this way of kind of like controlling the shape of the light. See how I made it into a square shape instead of a circular shape. Lots of really fun stuff in here. So play around a little bit with these. There's color curves you can bring into them, all sorts of stuff. Spotlights, very, very handy. All right, I'm going to close this window, get rid of my spotlight. And I think we'll stop with an area light for right now. So an area light right here. You're going to see there's also area lights inside of Arnold as well. And these are directional. They're a little bit different. So if I click off of it, you can see it's kind of like a little flat little plane there, and then it has a little line coming out of it. And the line kind of directs where the light is going. So again, kind of a directional little light. I can scale these up in size. I can move this over here, and then this is going to kind of control where that light comes from. So a little bit different. It's more like a big flat light source, so it's a little bit more diffused than like a spotlight or like a point light where it's coming from one single spot point in space and going in all directions. This one is that whole flat plane is going to illuminate. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Bring up my render window again. There we go. That really lights up the whole area. It still has some nice shadows kind of curving down underneath the object. If I take this light though and scale it down a bit and do that again, you see way less intense, more fall off into the environment. So scaling it really does play with its intensity, but so does its location in space. So if I bring it a little closer here and render it again, then I get a harder, softer kind of drop off there, right? Shadows, again, if I wanted to interact with its environment, I can come in here and use depth shadows, maybe bring up the resolution a little bit. Now we're going to see it casting shadows onto its environment, a little harsher light there. I can play around with the resolution of that. Maybe I bring that back out a little bit and I get a little bit of a softer, there we go, a little bit of a softer light with the shadow underneath it. So lots of possibilities there. Bring this up. There we go. You can see the full spread of the shadow on that. So I'll turn that off as well. So again, these area lights are great. You play with intensity, play with all of that. I'm going to go ahead and just show you a few differences. I turned depth shadows back off. So I'm going to turn off emit specular. It kind of flattens out. You don't get as much of the specular reflection on the object. You'll see this more as we get into more high-end rendering and different textures. Emit diffuse light. You really have to have diffuse light to be able to see it, so you want to have that on. There's only a few situations where you wouldn't have that. And illuminates by default. Again, you want to have that on unless it's actually creating some visible light, and we'll talk about that down the road, okay? More light effects you can do in here. There's some glow effects and things like that, but again, more advanced features we'll get to down the road. So I think that's it for, we'll come back and look at volume lights later. I want to talk a little bit about some of the Arnold lights as well, because I showed you the standard lights. They do work with the Arnold Render, so there's two types of renders we're going to talk about in actually coming up in very soon on some of your lessons here. But to start this lesson off, I went to the render settings, I clicked on this little icon with the blue gear, and I changed, by default it's on Arnold, I had changed to Maya software. But now we're going to look at Arnold based lights, so I'm going to switch back to the Arnold renderer. And what's cool about the Arnold render is there's actually like a live render that we can do, so we don't have to constantly like open up that window and close it. So if I click on the Arnold tab, you'll see there's a bunch of lights over here, and we're going to look at those. But I also have this great thing called the Arnold Render view. And what's cool is I can actually change any of these views to show me a live render view. So I can either click this little guy, and if I hit play on it, it's going to show me my object. And as you can see, you could barely even see anything because I still have that standard area light. And like I said before, you have to really bring up the intensity on your objects to be able to see. And actually that's in top. Let me go to perspective view. You have to really bring up the intensity to be able to see this, like 100 instead of 10. Now I can actually see it with a standard light. You can see obviously there's a big quality difference here in what we're seeing in this live render view. With the Arnold render. Arnold is a much higher end render system. It calculates a lot more light bounces, the quality of light, all of that fun stuff. So again, I'd have to actually type in, like 20 doesn't do much. I have to type in 200 on the standard light, and now I'm starting to get back to where I was before, right? So this Arnold preview is really nice for that. I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button on that and close it, because I want you to see that I can also go to Arnold and switch. Instead of standard viewport under this little render tab, I can go to Arnold Viewport, and I can hit play on that. And I can actually make this viewport a whole Arnold render view, which is awesome, right? Let me click off of that. And as long as I have that running up there, I can even like move around, and it sort of gives you like a little preview while it catches up on it, and eventually you'll see all these little details and the shadows get soft and have all the detail in it. So anyway, this is really nice when we're making changes to things like lights, because we can see it happen live, right? So honestly, I rarely even use the Maya software render unless I just need to be really quick. Arnold Render is where it's at. We'll talk a little bit more about the software render, but it allows me to just like see things live as I move through them, right? Now it does take a lot of processing power, so if you don't have a computer that can handle it, you probably don't want to do this live view. You actually don't have to do the live view. You can always, just hit render, and it'll do a pop-up like before, and then I can hit the play and button, and it will render live, or it can just render single frames. So I can always click on this window as well and hit render, and it will sit there and take the time to render out in perfect quality of what it'll look like if I rendered this as an image right now. So again, that was just using the same standard open render view button that we used for the software render. Or stick with what I'm showing you right now with the Arnold stuff as well. So I'm going to go back to the Arnold Viewport render. I really like that. So let's look at some of these other lights. I'm going to delete the area light. Let me stop the rendering here for a second. Make it a little easier to delete stuff. And I'm going to bring in create a standard Arnold area light. It's inside the objects. I need to move it up. It always goes to that center origin point. And you see their area lights, very similar. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this so you can see it. Flat plane, a little arm sticking out of it to show you kind of the direction of it. Again, I like to go to four-way view just so I can really kind of see where this light is at in space. Let's get this rotated around. There we go. If I render that guy, now you can see its settings are way too low right now. Right now, its intensity is at 1. Now, Arnold Lights have both intensity and exposure. So what happens if I tape that up to 10? Okay, that's much better. Now let's do 50. Even better. Now that in conjunction with exposure and little tweaks to the exposure can really bring up the brightness of that light. And so it's this combination of both of these things working together, right? Really, really nice on that. Whoop. You have to watch out. Even right now I'm on a high-end machine, and because I'm running the I'm going to stop that because my Arnold was going a little wonky on me right there. So I'm stopping that little guy. Let me go back to my default light settings there. There we go. Intensity and exposure. So sometimes you got to watch out how much RAM do you have, all of that fun stuff, because I messed around with a few things, and yeah, I ended up messing something up. So I'm going to delete that area light and just bring that in again. Let's move this back. Let me stop the Arnold render for a second. It's better for making little tweaks than to leave it up all the time, because it does eat up a lot of your computer memory. So just keep that in mind as you're doing it. So sometimes I'll just come in on the area light now and tweak. Okay, where do I want to get the intensity? Let's bump up the exposure. But maybe not just like do a whole bunch of modeling in there at the same time, okay? So that's pretty good. I like that. Bring it up again. Maybe tweak the exposure up just a little bit more. Yeah, that's looking nice. Gives me an idea of what this is all going to look like, right? Okay. Now, let's stop this render again. I'm going to go ahead and show you beyond the area light. We've also got a mesh light. Now, a mesh light can turn any object into a light. So I can go ahead and maybe create, very quickly, I'll create a, let's create a torus. This will be like a weird, like fluorescent tube, right? And I'll bring this out here. And I'll go four-way view. Let's rotate this a little bit so it's sending the light the way I want it to. Let's scale it up. And just on the poly torus, I'm going to bring in get its radius, but kind of bring it down so it's not quite so thick. There we go. Let's do like 0.25. Cool. So I've got this like ring hovering above it now. Now, let's see what happens when I turn this in, and I go back to the Arnold tab. I have to have the object selected, and then I'm going to go ahead and say create mesh light. So that actually turns it into a light source. If I preview, it's hard to see it because its intensity is down. But let's go ahead and turn that off real quick, and I'm going to move it a little bit closer. Let's move this over here. Should be good. Let's bring its intensity, say, up to at least like 6. You can start to see it. Let's grab that torus again. I'm sorry, the mesh light. The mesh light is actually inside the torus. It becomes kind of a child of it. So let's bring this intensity up to like 20. There we go. Now it's starting to light it up a bit more. And let's bring the exposure up as well, right? There we go. Now there's a bit of noise in there, but it's just kind of like generating the object up, which is really cool. Now I could make the light visible, which is kind of fun. Let me turn this off real quick. Come on. My computer's chunking up on me a little bit. There we go, we pop back. Now I'm going to make this a visible light. Let me click on the guy here and turn it on. And let's go ahead and preview that again. See, that's how I can make any object actually like a light source that emits light as well. Which is really cool. Now that's kind of a chunky looking shape on the poly torus. I'm going to go ahead and subdivide it a little bit. Now I've got this like glowing halo, right? Which is kind of fun. If I move this around, you can kind of see it in space. There we go. Give you a little better view on it. So really fun for mesh lights. Often use this. So this could be a fluorescent tube that's actually emitting light right now, which is really great. Or I could create a little flame shape and put it on a candle tip or something like that. So there's a lot of possibilities here. If I increase the samples on this, you get a higher quality light out of it. Obviously my render time, you can see, is exponentially going up. It's taking more and more time to get that nice clean light out of it. I could play around with a lot of the different settings in here. I could bring up its intensity, I could bring up its exposure. I usually try to keep these somewhat close to each other to not like blow one or the other out. As you can see, I'm getting a really cool kind of like, you know, form out of it there. Let me go ahead and close that. So mesh lights really come in handy a lot. Any object, just create the object, have it selected, and then click on the mesh light. But again, these lights only work in the Arnold Render. We have create a photometric light. I'm not going to go into photometric lights right now. We will have a future lesson on those, but really advanced lights that can literally take specifications of existing lights from the real world and kind of recreate them. You can download these little photometric files and load them into them and create a specific type of light bulb or spotlight from the real world. Very photorealistic. Something a lot of students love are these Skydome lights. This is not just a light, but it's sort of like this big environment bubble that surrounds your whole object. If I go way out, you can see it's almost created this sort of like world around it. You'll see I no longer will have a black background. When I go to render, I'm going to have like a whole world that's lit up. The only downside of this is it's kind of like the ambient light. It just really like takes a lot of definition out of your object. There's a little shadow under there, but it's like light from all angles. It almost kind of just washes everything out. So use it with a grain of salt, and that's with only an intensity of 1. So, you bring this up and it completely washes out your object. So just keep in mind, they're very useful for creating a background. I'll be showing you in a future lesson how you can actually put an image into one of these sky domes to kind of give you like a seamless background. But just watch, like I said, they really do wash out quite a bit. So if you're going to use one, and they can introduce a lot of noise into your renders when you're using other lights. So we'll talk about ways that we can still use them, but maybe not wash the scene out so much, okay? All right. So we'll get that. And then Skydome. There's light portals and physical skies, but we'll talk about those in a future lesson. I think a good way to just start off with the Arnold Lights is creating area lights, mesh lights, and sky domes. On our next lighting lesson, we'll talk about photometric lights, light portals, and physical skies. But I think that's a good start for now. Big thing to take away is just remember render settings, right? If you try to use a standard light from just the regular rendering tab, inside Arnold rendering, you're going to be like, why is the whole scene black? I can't see anything. It's because you're using the Arnold renderer, or because you don't have the intensity up high enough. So either turn that way up, type in like 100 or 200 on one of those standard lights, or come here to your render settings and switch back to Maya software. But when you're ready to use the Arnold renderer, then you can start using these Arnold lights, and you can still use all these old ones. Just like I said, make sure you increase its intensity enough. It's going to be a really important part of it here. If I bring this in on a point light, I can't go with 1. I've got to literally double in like 100. And then when I go to Arnold and I preview it here, then I'm going to be able to actually see my object, right? So if I just went with that 10, my object's barely lit up, or 1. And it's really barely lit up by default. So you can still use the standard lights, just really boost up the settings on them, and you'll still get some really nice results, right? Yeah, very cool. All right, that's it for now. Enjoy playing with lighting, and we'll go from there.